Yeah, welcome everybody, and welcome to the second in the series of winter webinars from Germinal. Thank you for taking the time to join us this evening. Just before we start, there's a few points I need to cover. Please ask questions as we go along. There is a Q&A button at the bottom of the screen. If you type your questions in there, they can be anonymous if you want them to be. I won't be calling out anybody's surname, so it'll only be first names only if you do leave your name on the question. But ask questions as we go along, and I'll either interject with the two speakers or ask the questions at the end. We have increased the size of the question and answer session at the end of the hour-long webinar tonight as a response to what was filled out on the survey last time. So please fill out the survey at the end of the hour and help us to make the next webinar even more enjoyable and what you want to hear. The session is being recorded so that we can send out a link for those that aren't able to join us tonight. And any questions that you do ask that we don't get to answer tonight, we will put answers on the email that we'll send to you in the next day or two, just when we send you the link to the recording. Just for those of you who are not familiar with Germinal, we are a family-owned business. We are 7th generation and coming up very shortly to 200 years old. We sell forage seeds to merchants in GB, in Northern Ireland, in Ireland, and in fact to 25 other countries around the world. We're passionate about forage for livestock in whatever guise that takes, and we try to deliver these products through innovation and research. We are heavily linked with IBERS at Aberystwyth University, where we breed the clovers and grasses, the high sugar grasses, and we also have our own research facility down in Melksham, where we carry out a lot of replicated plot trial work to put some science behind the innovation and the theory that we've got on different products. We then have a great deal of on-farm trial work and demo work going on to put those concepts into practice with modern farming techniques. So we hope that brings products to the market that are tried and trusted, and yeah, so that's where Germinal fits in. So tonight's session on outwintering brassicas. Well, a lot of you got interested in brassicas. We are aware that brassicas can reduce the bought-in feed costs. They have health benefits for the animals. They can reduce the housing costs. And I'm going to hand over now to William Fleming, who is our area manager for Scotland and the North East, to take us through this first part of the webinar. William.
Thanks, Ben. In this first section of the webinar, we're going to deal with some of the key benefits and the crop selections for the successful outwintering of livestock on brassicas. So we'll just run through some of these key benefits. First and foremost is forage self-sufficiency. Anything that we can do on farm to increase the total tonnage of dry matter that we can produce on farm for home produced feed makes farms more viable and more self-sufficient and less reliant on purchased concentrates or purchased bulky feeds to provide energy. Crop rotation is the next one of these key benefits. On a livestock farm, the difficulty of going from a grass to a grass reseed has increased dramatically in the last few years with reductions in the amount of chemicals that are available for controlling weeds and also for controlling pests. So a brassica fits in really well here. It gives us two opportunities to control the weeds, once before we sow the brassicas and then at the end of the brassica crop before you go back in with your grass reseed. And it also breaks that pest cycle for leather jackets to allow you to get a more successful reseed at the end of the brassica crop. There are health benefits. We all know that stock outside do better. We've got less pressure on the animal systems, and also because they're not confined within an airspace and sheds, you've got less chances of pneumonia and less infectious diseases that can build up within housing systems. And just that fresh air, everything works an awful lot better. There's also a reduction in the amount of labour required for outwintering. You're not having to feed these cattle inside, you're not having to scrape them out from cubicles, put sawdust down, or bed them up with straw, either physically by hand or mechanically. And the one thing that's forgotten when we talk about this is the fact that all that waste, that slurry and that farmyard manure, not only are you building up during the course of the winter, you're then to handle it and spread it out again. So there's a huge amount of cost there. Whereas if you're out wintering on brassicas, an hour or so shifting an electric fence once a day, the cattle are bedded, they're fed, you've taken the net or the wrap off your haylage or your bales of straw, the whole job is done. The cattle are outside, they're eating, they're standing on that new bit where they've been, and they're lying there, and they're defecating and urinating back in the field, so they're increasing organic matter straight back into the soils and bringing health benefits for your soils there. We'll talk about forage stocks, and we'll talk about that a wee bit more later on, but brassicas, particularly when they're sown in the main crop brassicas before the end of June, they lift the total amount of dry matter and energy that's produced on a farm into the autumn and winter, and in the next slide we'll see how that impacts on the self-sufficiency. The stock numbers there, it allows you to increase the stocking density of your farm without having to spend huge amounts of capital building new sheds. A well set up and well managed outwintering system with brassicas allows you to increase your stocking density without the capital expenditure in sheds. And the more units of kilograms of beef or lamb or litres of milk that you can sell off a farm without having to invest massively in infrastructure makes businesses more viable. And perhaps one of the most important ones here is reducing costs. We've got a huge amount of volatility in the markets. Currently, sheep prices and beef are working away quite nicely, but we've got Brexit on the horizon, and there's a huge amount of factors outside the farm gate that are going to have an impact on the price that we receive for our produce. So anything that we can do on farm to reduce that reliance on bought-in concentrates, as I said, or bought-in bulky feeds, is going to help make the businesses more sustainable and reduce the unit cost of production to allow businesses to survive this volatility. And this is some of the factors that Helen will show in their costings later on in the webinar. As I said, we mentioned self-sufficiency, and this graph here is really to demonstrate how brassicas fit into the homegrown forage supply. In green, we have a typical grass growth curve. So what that means, whatever an average year is. And in lilac, we have where the brassica fits into that forage supply and how it can even out and lift the total forage dry matter production on farm. I make no bones about starting off with cross-compliance. If we get the cross-compliance part of outwintering and brassicas completed successfully, you're halfway there to having a successful outwintering with stock. Farmers will always look at the animal health implications first and foremost, and for outwintering, the cattle or sheep need to be fit and healthy and in good body condition at the start of the winter grazing period. And it's imperative that you take the time to draw out any cattle or sheep that are not as fit or have any health issues, and use what shed space you have to give those cattle or sheep some TLC to allow them to express their genetic potential over the course of the winter. Cattle and sheep that are outwintered in brassicas, they will have a slightly higher maintenance requirement, but as we'll see from some of the slides later on, the energy supply in the brassica more than meets that, and then allows them to start and put on weight and condition over the course of their wintering period. When an adequate length of feed face is available daily, Cattle in particular will stand there, they'll eat at it, and they'll lie in this new area that's allocated, and they only tend to go away to drink water when they desire it, or if they're seeking shelter in extremely bad weather. So soil health and soil structure isn't being compromised. The top of the soil may look a bit mucky and a bit wet and slippery, as we would say in the west of Scotland, but that's just because the cattle are walking across the top of it, they're defecating and urinating there. But if you take a spade and look down into that soil structure, it's still intact and really good, and all you're doing is increasing the organic matter in the surface layers of your soil by doing this. This slide shows what we really don't want to see. It breaks all the rules, and even from a practical point of view, all the soil fertility benefits and are negated by the damage that's been done to soil structure by tractors running across this field. And from a regulatory perspective, be that the Department of Agriculture and any of the devolved countries, they're going to look on this unfavourably, and they're going to bring down the wrath on the farmer if they look after or treat their soil in this way over the course of the winter. Their priority is to protect the soils and protect the waterways. And when it comes to selecting appropriate fields and shifting stock, Helen's going to discuss some of these things later on as well. But really, from a practical point of view, the damage that's been done by these tractors being in the field, it's going to impact the yield potential for following crops in that field massively for 2 or 3 years until the soil structure is rectified and brought into a friable and good condition. We'll start with crop selection. There may be some of you who are grazing some of these just now, these catch crops, but these are unlikely to last until February. We tend to sow these catch crops, particularly the grazing turnips, stubble turnips and forage rape, earlier in the season, whereas the hybrids can be sown early in the year to be multiple grazings, grazed during the summer if there's a dry period, and then rested, ready to graze again at this time of year and into the winter. We'll discuss more of these crops in our webinar on the 30th of March next year, where we'll look at some of the options and the establishment techniques and where they fit into filling the forage supply over the course of the summer and early autumn. We'll move on to the main crops. These are what we're going to concentrate on this evening, and by main crops we mean brassicas that are sown by the end of June, ready to graze in the autumn and over winter. When we're asked about brassicas, there are two first questions that we will always ask. When do you want to be grazing the crop, and when does the field become available to sow? And these two questions will guide as to what is the most suitable brassica. Although fodder beet isn't a brassica, it is treated and used in a very similar way to Swedes. But careful consideration has to be given to variety selection with fodder beet, as achieving acceptable utilisation when grazed in situ can be difficult, because if you don't look for and use a lower dry matter variety and a variety that sits out of the ground, you're not going to get the utilisation required to make the justification of spending £1,000 a hectare to grow that crop worthwhile, when a crop of Swedes will cost you somewhere between £375 and £400 a hectare, and it becomes an expensive crop to grow. In this slide here, you see the difference in terms of the utilisation and the grazing of the stems. It's really all about selecting for that superior leaf to stem ratio, as that leaf is where all the best part of the nutrients are. The stems, if they're grazed, they do have an energy component, as we'll see later on, but you really want a balance between the lignin that's within the stem and the digestibility and the grazing of it. Really, the tallest crop isn't always the best. It's all about quality and utilisation. So it's important to pick varieties that are specifically geared for livestock and not for the game cover market. We'll start off with looking at Maris kestrel here. It's a high utilisation there, between 85 and 90%, and that's because the breeders will tell us that it has hit the sweet spot in terms of the amount of having enough lignin in the stems to hold the crop up, but not too much that makes it difficult for the stalk to eat and digest. As Maris kestrel is a relatively short grazing height, it allows it to be utilised by both cattle and sheep. And we're really looking for about between 11 and 12 tonnes of dry matter per hectare from Maris kestrel, and in about the 10 to 12 ME and at 19% protein. And as Maris kestrel is a main crop brassica, as we said, to highlight again, we're looking for 20 weeks between sowing and maturity, ready to utilise over the rest of the winter period. Triumph Swedes. The yields are for the bulbs here, and the energy is also from the bulbs from analysis work that we undertook and some of the trial work we did in the winter of 2018-2019. One of the things that we discovered in that trial when we were looking at Triumph, along with various other market-leading Swede varieties, was that the Triumph holds on to that leaf for a long period into the winter. And that contributes a significant amount of dry matter, between 2 and 4 tonnes of dry matter extra yield on the grazing of the Triumph, as well as having a crude protein of between over 25% crude protein. So when you get that crude protein in the leaf and the high energy in the bulb, you really have a complete diet for your stock going forward over the course of the winter. The big thing with Swedes is that they sit on top of the ground, so you're getting maximum utilisation, opposed to fodder beets and fodder beet varieties that grow into the ground and don't sit on the top for utilisation. Traditionally, Swedes have always been precision drilled with graded seed, but the calibre and quality of the modern direct drills in the market, the vast majority that we sell now is sold as natural and direct drilled into good seed beds that are well fertilised, ready to allow the crop to grow on. One of the things that we've found about Triumph, although it's a New Zealand bred variety, it really does have particularly good early vigour that makes it suitable for establishment within UK conditions. Moving on to the hybrids. Swift and Redstart. As we said earlier, they're able to be grazed more than once, and we're looking at yields between 6 and 10 tonnes of dry matter, and there's the quality there again, over 10 ME and 18 crude protein. But really, one of the major benefits for the hybrids is the flexibility that they bring to them. They can be drilled earlier in the spring so that they can be grazed over the summer when there's a potential forage shortage, rested and allowed to recover over the early part of the autumn so that they're ready to be able to be grazed again at this time of year. And when you use that sort of thing, it's also another way of giving you that break crop effect and breaking the pest cycle for leather jackets, and also helping you to control weeds in your subsequent reseed. This is from some of the trial work we did in 2018, and you can see here these varieties were Redstart and Swift, which we have, along with a couple of the leading market varieties and 2 new varieties that we were assessing. Now, this crop was sown on the 1st of August. It was replicated work that was done in 4 sites across the UK, and they were all drilled together in the same fields. And what we see here is that the Redstart, after 12 weeks, had the highest dry matter yield. But the Swift, the time we got to the end of the winter period, its total dry matter yield had caught up and achieved the same as the Redstart. We talked about the regrowth. This picture is from a crop of Redstart that was drilled on the 9th of June 2018. It was then grazed in early September, but when we graze it for the first time and we're looking to get that second grazing out of it, the real important part is you don't graze it hard down the way you would traditionally graze a brassica down. You want to leave some leaf on it so that it can photosynthesize and allow it to recover. So it was grazed in early September, and then we went back to it again and assessed the crop in the end of November. What we discovered there was that the stems had thickened significantly, but we had a mass of leaf in the top of the crop. And what we discovered was that that leaf, the crude protein and the ME of it was as good as crops that were only to be grazed on once. And the other thing that really was surprising was the fact that the stems, which are grazed well, had an ME of 11 and a crude protein of 11.6, which was more than we expected to see. But there was also a significant dry matter there of an extra 4.6 tonnes of dry matter at that point. We're now going to move on to Helen's section of the presentation, and I'll just stop sharing my screen just now to let Helen take over for the rest of the presentation.
Yeah, just while you're doing that, William, we've got a question coming from Zach. He's got some thin land. How can the brassicas help him with drought? Is there any way that brassica can help him with drought in the summer?
Yeah, when he's struggling for summer drought, if he can sow some of these, the catch crop brassicas, the grazing turnips like Appin, or even the hybrid as well, he can grow them early in the spring, probably early May. You want to be past any chance of frost. You want to have a soil temperature of about 10 degrees C and rising, so that you're ready to start and graze those after about 8 weeks. So if it's sown in early May, that's early June, early July, that's probably time in light land and thin land where he's going to be struggling for grass, and he's then got a brassica there to graze at that time of year, and it gives him an option in the autumn what he wants to do with it. If it's just a grazing turnip, then he's going to have to go to either a grass reseed in the autumn or some other crop in his rotation. If he uses a hybrid, he can rest it once he gets more grass coming in the autumn, and then it's there for him to graze again later in the winter before he goes for a reseed the following spring.
The secret there is, I think, as you said, getting the ground, allowing the ground to warm up before we put the seed in the ground. Brassicas do not do well in cold soils.
No.
Right, Helen, are you happy to take over? Can I just say to everybody, thank you. There are questions coming in now. Please keep them coming, even comments on what you've experienced or what you've seen. Yeah, the more interactive we make this, the better. Right, Helen, thank you.
You see my screen there?
Yes.
Yeah. Right, here we go. Good evening, everybody. And so brassicas are grown successfully in many situations, aren't they? And I'm sure some of you have got some good crops in the ground this year that should be reaching maturity. And even some of these main crops it won't be long before we're starting to graze them, depending on the variety and the species. But some of the main crops, as William was saying, so kales and swede, they're going to keep growing until probably for another month or so, until the soil temperatures drop a little lower than they are. But maybe some of you are already grazing some of the sort of faster growing brassicas that have been drilled in good time. So the next one is site selection. Yeah. So hopefully, your brassicas are growing in a field where you're going to be able to open it up and set it up for livestock to get good results in terms of crop performance, where you can graze it well over winter without causing any of that damage that William showed us. And you're going to be able to fulfill all the important areas of cross compliance, but also in terms of animal health and good soil health and good crop rotation. So free draining. Really, what we mean by free draining is nothing that's too heavy. So the heavier the soil, the lighter the stock class, and the fewer numbers of stock you'd put in the field. No threat to watercourses, obviously, or you need a really good buffer. And a lot of brassicas are obviously drilled after cereal or arable rotations at the moment, and very successfully too. But also we're seeing more crops drilled into old pasture. So there's some very good direct drills, as William said, that we're drilling direct into old grass swards, and they can be ideal for wintering, because you've got that old turf that just helps hold the soil together and keep the animals, you know, on the surface, so they can be an ideal out wintering site. Obviously, if you've got a brassica in now, no more brassicas for 5 years to avoid the potential for club root and so on. And really, when we talk about natural shelter for outwintering, we're really meaning the sort of the lee of the ground. So maybe you know, something that's sort of gently sloping but not too steep. If it's a slope on it, we're always going to graze it downhill. It's far easier to graze downhill, and you know, that will allow the animals maybe to get out of the lee of the wind or the bad weather. It may be walls or hedges or a wood. When we talk about shelter, we obviously you know, we don't mean buildings. We mean natural sort of shelter within the field. Okay, next one, thank you. So vitally important that we're feeding brassicas as part of a balanced diet to achieve the optimum results. So it's important that we feed fibre. So brassicas are low in fibre and high in sugars, but they contain good protein and good energy. But also we need to make sure there's access to water. You probably find they won't drink water when they go back to when they've got adapted to the brassica, but it's important that fresh water is available. We want a run back. A run back is really an area where we're also going to introduce the animals, so it can help us. You know, that might be a headland or all around the field, or it may be an adjacent area. So that's what we mean by a run back. And that's going to allow us to have this gentle adaptation to the crop, feeding fibre and feeding minerals, which I'm going to talk a little bit more about in a minute. So feeding systems. Okay. So do not allow a sudden and unrestricted access. So it's vitally important that this period of adaptation is a nice, slow and gradual one. So the ruminants, and we're going to change the nutrition. So the animals need time to adjust. And as we've already mentioned, the run back. So what we're trying to do is work up to a time when we're actually feeding around 70% of the animal's diet as brassica. And there's two things that we're trying to achieve by that gradual adaptation period. Is the first thing is this rumen health. So it's vital, you know, that they have that fibre, they you know, and a good quantity of it. So the fibre's there to well, really slow the flow of the brassica through the rumen. It creates the scratch factor. It helps them ruminate and cud and so on. The second reason we want that slow adaptation period is we're teaching the animals to eat the whole crop. So we want them to eat the leaf, and we want to eat it down to a grazing height to around sort of 4 or 6 centimetres. So as William said, you know, there's a lot of energy, and a lot of the feed value is in the leaf, but there's also a good amount of protein and energy and fibre in the stem, which is also useful. So usually strip grazed, but it can be block grazed. And again, it's these long narrow breaks, which we'll show a little bit more in a moment. And double fence it. So double fencing, by that really we mean you've got your wire, which is your feed face, and then you may have a second wire a yard or two behind that one. So when you actually move a wire, the animals can't go charging through the rest of the crop. They will only go up to the second break that you put in. It also means if they do break through during the day or whenever, they can't go right out there across the field. So you move your wire, you're actually putting in the following day's break. You know, your next day's break is already there. And indeed, we've had people that have block grazed them, that have set the field up in various blocks, and they've had, you know, different mobs of animals grazing in the same field. Most important is to measure the crop and make sure you know how much you're feeding. So we'll show you a little bit on that again as well in a moment. So feeding fibre. So fibre concentrations in brassicas are typically very low, and lower is what is considered optimal. So it's good, as we've already said, to put that fibre in for good rumination, for good rumen function. And the fibre can take the form of either hay or cereal, straw of some type, or even silage. And it depends really on the type of animals that you're feeding, and you know, how much nutrition you actually want them. So the brassica, very high quality, that can provide 70%, or even in some instances up to about 80% of the diet, and that will be very good nutrition for them. If you don't want to feed straw, if it's young stock and you want something higher quality than straw, then you know, you could feed hay or silage as well as part of the diet. We've already said fibre percentage is usually around 30%. That might be around 150 to 200 grams for a lamb a day, although lambs, particularly when they're adapted, they tend to stop eating straw altogether. Cattle, that could be between 1 and say 4 kilos of dry matter a day. We'll show you some more of those in a moment again. Right, so moving on to the next slide, William. So clearing clearing the area every day. As I said, that's when we're going to get the most efficient utilization of the crop. We want to grow a good crop, and we also want to eat the whole crop. So by introducing them slowly and allowing them just a small enough area for them to eat with either long narrow breaks or breaks that we know they can clear, that's how we're going to get optimum utilization. Thank you, William. Next one. So no tractors in winter. So it might be a fairly typical situation that you've grown your crop, you haven't quite thought about how much fibre you're going to need in there at the moment, and you're looking at this lovely crop of brassica and you're thinking, well, I don't want to make a mess of that and put you know, wheelings in it and all the rest of it. You'll make far less mess now, by driving through and pushing your bales off the side of the trailer than you will by going in and out of that field in the winter. So I'd encourage you to go and have a sort of a bit of a stab at measuring your crop and work out how much brassica you've got there, how long it's going to last you, and then we can calculate roughly how many bales you need to put out. But by simply driving through, as you can see there, and then back out again and pushing the bales off the trailer, you're going to make a lot less mess that way than you will do in winter. So moving the fence every day. Now, I think I can remember the picture I put in here, and if I remember rightly, it's some cows, and at the back of the crop at the end of the cows, you can see that there's what I would call a whirligig, and it's kind of a multi-pronged rotary thing with the electric wire running through it. And each of those, the tips of those spokes is a metre wide. So very, very simple to walk along that feed face and move the wire by exactly a metre. So that's a summer crop. It was actually a redstart crop growing in Staffordshire in the summer, and it's a very easy way of you know, just giving them a metre a day and having a nice long narrow break. The other reason those cows that are grazing that are actually dairy cows, so obviously they were milking, they were in summer, so we'd be wanting to restrict how much brassica they were eating in midsummer to avoid milk taint. Right, moving on now to how much do I need to feed? So this is one of the most common questions we get. How many acres do I need to grow for how many animals? What stocking rate will it tolerate, and so on. So quite simply, you're going to need some shears. You're going to need something to measure the crop with. I use a metre stick that's exactly a metre long, and some little pegs to put in the ground. You'll need a bag to put the fresh forage in, and some sort of scale. So you cut your metre square down to the grazing height, so that's around 4 to 6 inches, and collect the forage, put it in the bag and weigh it. Repeat that several times across the grazing area, and so you know you've got a good average sort of representation of how much crop you've actually got there. And weigh that. You might get sort of 6 kilos fresh weight or whatever. Multiply that weight in the bag by a dry matter of between 12 and 15%. So the more mature crops, probably a kale, will be nearer 15% dry matter. A much younger crop earlier in the year might be around 12% dry matter. So you multiply your 6 kilos by your 15% dry matter, and you get 0.9 of a kg of dry matter per square metre. So that means that each hectare, there is 9 tonnes or 9,000 kgs of forage dry matter available to graze. The other bit of information that we need to know is what the average weight of the animals is and what their daily dry matter intake requirements are going to be. So if we go on now to the daily allocation. So in this instance, I've assumed that we're feeding dry cows. Yeah, I've got the right slide. So dry cows, average weight around 650 kgs of dry matter. a maintenance ration for dry cows or for any dry stock will be 2%. So 2% is a maintenance, 2% of their body weight. So young stock or animals that are growing, they would need more than 2% of their body weight. But in this case, with dry cows, 2% of the body weight, they weigh 650 kilos. So we're trying to feed them 13 kgs of dry matter a day. That's going to be made up of 70% of it is brassica. So 70% of 13, we've got 9.1 kilos of dry matter a day that we're going to feed as brassica. Fibre allocation, therefore, is going to be 30% of the 13 kilos, so 3.9 kgs of brassica. And therefore, we're going to be feeding around 10 square meters of brassica to get that, you know, that 9.1 kilos into the cows. We multiply the 9.1 kgs of dry matter by 0.9, which is the square meterage, then we come up with 10 square meters per cow per day. And to keep it simple, I've just said, assume that we've got 100 cows, therefore the totally daily allocation will be 1,000 square meters. Okay, now we're feeding wheat straw to these cows, let's say, and I'm assuming that a big bale of fresh weight of wheat straw, the bale's going to weigh around 300 kilos. So we multiply that with a dry matter of around 85–90%. So our bales are going to weigh around 270 kilos, although they won't weigh that. There will be 270 kilos of dry matter in each bale. Therefore, to get that 3.9 kilos in each of them, we need 390 kilos a day. And that would be 1.5 bales a day. Okay, you see how I've got to that? So total brassica will be 910 kilos. So each hectare, if we're feeding 1,000 square meters a day, when we get well adapted to it, we'd be feeding, each hectare would be feeding us for 10 days. So each hectare is 10 days grazing. So number of bales per hectare, we're going to need 15 bales a hectare. Okay. And then, you know, if we want the field to last 100 days, if the winter's 100 days, then it's obviously 10 hectares. And that's a fairly good guide for you. 10 hectares of a good crop of kale will last 100 cows for around 100 days. So that's sort of a basic rule of thumb, and you can work upwards or downwards from that. Now, this adaptation, I would say, you know, we're saying that our total daily area is going to be around 1,000 square meters. I would suggest to introduce them, you give them as little as 200 for maybe a day or two. So they've literally got a couple of meters each. They'll go and nibble that down. They're only eating a couple of kilos then, and then they'll move back onto the run back or whatever forage you've got there for them. And then after a couple of days, you move it up to 300 or 400 square meters. So it's taking you easily sort of between 10 and 15 days and even up to 3 weeks to allow them to adapt nice and slowly to that, you know, to that brassica, so to avoid any potential issues. Thank you, William. I think the next slide is feeding minerals. Yeah, okay. So feeding minerals, well, they're low in copper, selenium and iodine. We'd also feed vitamin E, and they're low in phosphorus and magnesium, but they are high in calcium. So you do need to just pay attention to that with cows, you know, in late gestation, to make sure. Usually you take them out about 3 weeks before. You don't want sort of high calcium in late gestation cows. Having said that, I do know people that have actually carved on it, though that's not something that we would recommend. So low in copper, and also brassicas are high in sulfur compounds called glucosinolates, and they further antagonize the uptake of copper. So it is important to feed copper. Selenium and iodine are also going to help prevent any goitrogens. Yeah, so goitrogens are compounds that are also in brassicas, and when you get high levels of them and they eat too much of it, it can block the uptake of iodine into the thyroid, and that's goiter, which is that sort of lump that you'll see. So to prevent that's why we need to feed copper and selenium and iodine, and then vitamin E would be used to you know, to complement the uptake of those. So make sure you feed minerals. As I said, you can bolus, or you put bags on the bales, or you can put licks out. But the best way to make sure that all the animals have had the minerals that they need is to get a bolus in them.
Helen, can I just interrupt you? Question from Daniel here. I'm not sure if he's got a crop of early drilled oilseed rape with clover in the bottom, or whether he's responsible for a crop. But he's suggesting to graze it for growth regulation and disease suppression with sheep. Any differences with oilseed rape compared to forage rape to consider? Some of it's hybrid rape and some's conventional.
Okay. Well, I'd like to see what the crop looks like, and it comes down to how much you're actually going to feed them. So if it's only a very small percentage of the diet, bear in mind they will need some fibre. They'll still need fibre and something else to eat. If it's a small percentage of what they're eating, that's probably not a problem. If it's a high percentage of what they're feeding, you need to make sure that you're still getting fibre into them. And oilseed rapes do. I don't know what the glucosinolate levels are of all the forage brassicas as we'd know on the market compared to oilseed rape brassicas, but there are, obviously different levels of glucosinolates. So how that compares with oilseed rape varieties, I don't know. It's not work that's been done as far as I'm aware. But I would say you still need, they still contain these sort of brassica toxins, so SMCOs, which particularly in fertile soils where you've got high-end soils and maybe high sulfur in your soil as well, then you can see other issues when it comes to grazing, which would be caused by those toxins that can be present in a brassica, particularly when it's growing quickly, when you've got a young plant. So often when the plant's only about 2 months old, you see things. We might get some questions later on, so I'll carry on, Ben. I don't want to just sort of keep talking about those, but yeah, is that okay? I think the next slide is growing costs. Yeah, that's great. So seed costs here, the hybrids probably cost around £60 a hectare, and kale is obviously a dearer seed, so would Swedes be. You're looking maybe at about £120 for the seed. And I've assumed a sort of a very low min-till type approach to establishing the brassicas here. So that might be a spray off with with glyphosate, and then just direct drilled and put a cost in for a direct drill, whether it's a TSEM or whatever, of around £40 a hectare. We'd always recommend you do feed the brassica. Normally it is just nitrogen, but it could be N and a small amount of P and K, and some people will use triple 16 or whatever. And very often, you're going to need a dose of lime or a dose of a prilled fast-acting lime if you're trying to just neutralize the surface there. So our growing costs around that 170, 230, maybe 250 pounds per hectare. And you could see on the left there, that's a picture that we took, Luke. That's last week. That's a fresh weight in that bag of a kale that was still growing, of just over 6 kilos. So that's the reference that I've used earlier on. So around 9 tons of dry matter per hectare. That's going to give us a growing cost of between, just under 2p to maybe 2.5p per kilo of dry matter. That's purely the growing cost. Okay. Yeah, what else is on that slide? Okay, yeah, so it's around between 2 and 2.5p per kilo of dry matter to grow the crop. Thank you. And when we look at the diet cost comparison, I've assumed again that we've got these same dry cows, and we've got maybe a typical house ration for sucklers or whatever in winter might be around 50-50 straw to silage. That might, they might increase the silage content the nearer they get to calving, or they get closer to calving, or if you're putting condition on them, there may be more silage going into the diet. And I might have to help me with the numbers here because I can't quite read them, but I think I've got about 6.5 kilos of each. And if I remember rightly from the figures that we've just given of the cost per kilo of dry matter, we've got straw, wheat straw, excuse me, £120 a tonne fresh weight. which gives us a dry matter of around £140, so 14p per kilo. We're looking at 90 odd p for the straw, for the wheat straw, and then the brassica at whatever it is, 2.6p per kilo of dry matter. And we're feeding, no, sorry, the silage, sorry, I've got silage as well. It's £120 a ton. So what have we got? 70p of silage in there, something like that, or 60p of silage. You've got a daily cost for the animals indoors. Feed cost alone, you're around £1.70 daily feed cost for, excuse me, for those cows. Your brassica diet out of doors, your straw, we're only eating 3.9 kilos of it, so it's in there at the same rate. And then we've got the brassica at maybe £26 a ton, and we're eating just over 9 kilos, so that's 23p. We've got the daily feed cost out of doors of around, I think it's 80 odd p, isn't it? So really the feed costs indoors compared to outdoors, it's 80p a day cheaper per cow. So those 100 cows that we're talking about, that's what's that? So, you know, over a winter, is it 80 quid a day?
It's over £90. The difference is £90 a day for those.
Thank you, Ben. Thank you. Yeah, so £90 a day over a 100-day winter. You know, you've got there's 9,000 quid that you've saved for those, that just that 100 days on those 100 cows. Significant savings just on feed cost alone, without considering the you know, the other benefits that that William talked to us about there. So just in summary now, planning really is important, but we do want to try and keep it very, very simple. I think there are a few key things to remember, particularly when we're trying to support out wintering, that we need to sort of get right when it actually comes to the, you know, when it comes to the actual feed out, and to get the full benefit of the brassica and good utilization and get good nutrition from it and good animal performance. That adaptation period is crucial. The way we set that up, the way we put the run back and so on. So a nice slow adaptation, and think about how we're going to get the animals into the crop over a, you know, 2 weeks or more. Good adaptation period. Absolutely no tractors in the field in winter. So we need to get the fibre into the field and make sure we sorted out the access to water, and you know, we're going to be able to give them all those fresh breaks and a nice long narrow feed face and so on, with preferably, you know, removing that wire every day. And that's, you know, we can come at the end of the winter with a really, really good seed bed, provided we've you know, we've observed all these items of good practice. And then obviously the final one again is knowing exactly how much you're feeding. And even though you think, well, I've got this much, I'm measuring it, you're trying to work out how long it's going to feed you. The other option is, well, if the field is 200 meters long, you want to feed them 2 meters a day, well, that will last you 100 days, won't it? So that's another way of doing it. But you still need to know how much you're putting in front of each animal, even if you are just going to divide the field up by the number of days you think it's going to last you. You still need to know what they're actually eating. And then I think, you know, there are multiple benefits. I'm not going to run through them all. William did that really very, very well. But I think there are three main things, as I see, for brassicas. If you're trying to increase your overall forage and your yields, maybe livestock numbers as well. If you're looking for a good, reliable break crop that's easy to grow, you're looking for something cheap and healthy to feed, well, then brassicas are going to be the answer for you. So thank you very much, everybody. And as William said, there are we've got a you know, we've not talked today about establishment and management in the early stages and actually growing the crop and crop selection in a bit more detail, but we'll be dealing with that next spring. Tonight we just wanted to talk about some of the intricacies and to help people get the best out of feeding the crop over winter. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Helen. There are lots of questions, but please keep sending them in. We'll get to them even if it's not nice. First question from Ivan. Which is the best brassica for calf dairy heifers over the winter?
Calf dairy heifers?
Yeah.
My opinion would be kale. I like kale. I like Maris kestrel kale for the reasons William said. It's got the optimum in terms of yield and height, and it'll stand up, but it doesn't get too tall. And it's got the, you know, it's the optimum sort of nutrition. and the hybrids work well too. So I mean, really the question comes back down, as William said, to when can you actually grow it. So okay, we'd like to grow kale. I think that's the ultimate outwintering crop, but when can you sow it? So if you can sow it before the end of June, maybe the first few days of July, depending on where you are in the country, then that's fine. If you're talking about the end of July or early August, well then straight away you'd be looking at one of the hybrids, either redstart or kale.
Okay, Mike's got a question here. When feeding a rape or hybrid, what causes the ears to fall off fattening lambs, and how can it be prevented?
Okay, so the ears falling off is actually rape scald, and it's more typical, obviously, of white-faced sheep. It's actually those toxins that we were talking about, and I think the worst one is the SMCOs. So there are compounds in brassicas, all brassicas, called S-methylcysteine sulfoxide, and it can be responsible for a few of these disorders. And basically the buildup of that, you know, in the rumen causes a reaction in the animal that gives it this photosensitivity. So the face starts to swell, and the white-faced sheep, it starts as sort of like sunburn, but then the heads swell and their ears will fall off, and it can obviously fatal. But it's not, you know, if you start to see that happening, you need to pull them away. You know, you need to reduce their amount of brassica that they're eating, feed more fiber. It probably doesn't affect all the animals. It probably only affects a few of them, but it's a slow adaptation again. Feed fiber, and if you start to see an issue, you must feed less of it. And if it's affecting a lot of them, it will affect the live weight gain as well. Although some people tell me that they didn't notice the live weight gain, but ideally you're going to have to pull them off it, or feed less. But slow adaptation, and it's something that's typical. So these sort of toxins build up when the plant is growing very rapidly. So it's typically either a young plant, probably only a couple of months old, or it may also be the toxins are higher in plants as they're coming nearer flowering. So I know sometimes we have, say, a kale crop that we've overwintered, and we get to March, and we get a warm, mild March, and the crop starts growing again and starts trying to flower. That's when the SMCOs are higher then as well. And it's when we get sort of a really growy year and there's enough moisture around, and we've got high N in the soil and perhaps high sulfur in the soil, that's when you're going to start to see the tendency. We've not had many phone calls on that sort of thing this year. It was obviously a wetter back end. It's usually August and September, and I don't remember too many last year either. But in 2018, when it was very, very warm and very growy but damp as well in August and September, there were a lot of issues because we'd got a lot of young plants that were growing very, very quickly, and there was a lot of N about in the soil, and the plants, therefore, you know, the brassicas were high in all these sort of toxins. So you've just got to be careful when it's like that, and feed less of it, and feed straw. Once the plant stops growing and the weather goes cold and the sun stops shining, so the rape scald is a reaction to the sunshine as well, and white-faced sheep, then the problem goes away. But there are varietal differences, I believe, but it's environmental conditions that create it, that make that happen. Was a long answer.
Okay, very thorough, thank you. One here from John. How does the pH of the soils affect the brassica rotation? And I think John's referring here to how frequently you can resow brassicas given a high pH.
Mm-hmm. Me to answer that?
You can do, I can do it. It's up to you. Yeah.
Now, well, I mean, obviously, sort of vegetables and brassicas, we do try and put them on higher pH to help prevent it. And vegetables are obviously grown on very high pH soils, but so often we're using them in grassland rotations or maybe with arable crops, and we wouldn't recommend just pushing the pH up to allow you to grow a brassica more often. I'd rather recommend you have a good rotation. Now, and club root, which is obviously the main issue why we need the 5 years, it likes wetter soil. So the wetter the soil, the heavier the soil, the more prone to. So club root is a sort of soil-borne fungus, isn't it? So it likes those damper soils, and I'd be very loath to break that 5 years. But I know people do, and I know, you know, they will try and counteract that by adding more lime. But we would say, you know, your optimum pH for growing a livestock brassica is 6.5, very similar to grassland, and we wouldn't recommend getting it a great deal higher than that. But you know, I know there are people that do, and there are people that break the you know, the 5-year rule as well. But if it starts to go wrong, and particularly in wet years, it can. Well, the problem is with club root, once you've got it, you can't go back for a very, very long time. So, yeah.
It is worth saying that all the brassica varieties that we breed, that we don't breed them, we bring across from PGG Wrightsons have been through a very extensive club root resistant trials process. There is no such thing as a club root resistant variety, because as the club root it changes in the soil, so new varieties, new strains are evolving all the time. The only thing that one can say as a breeder is that it's resistant to all the strains that we know at that moment. But going back to the original question, yes, lime, the higher pHs will inhibit the club root formation in the soil, but you can't. Helen's right, I believe. You know, you don't change that five-year rule. A couple of people have asked. Last question, probably. We will reply to the others, but a couple of people have asked about fertilizer and establishing brassicas. Obviously, it's different for different brassicas, but is there any sort of standard figures? We need to be careful here on advising fertilizer regimes, but is there anything we can offer?
We wouldn't go on and give a recommendation without a kind of, because none of us are really facts. Well, Helen's facts based, qualified. So, and it also depends on your soil analysis. Yeah. But if you go into the website, you'll see in our Brassica Growers Guide, we have kind of a general rule of thumb there on the fertilizer requirements for the different brassicas and the different crops and when they should be applied. And those are kind of based on the RB209 figures. But really, you should get a soil sample done and base your recommendations on your own particular circumstances with a facts-based, facts qualified advisor.
Yeah. Okay. Really well. I think that is exactly an hour. I think we'll draw it to a close there. Other than to say, as William just pointed out, on the website germinal.co.uk, there are is a great manual there that we've built on brassica management, and there's also product information sheets on some of the different products that we have. So there's lots of information there. There's more articles coming on during the month of November, brassica work that we're doing that you'll see in the press and other bits and bobs, and it'll also be on the website. So keep an eye on that. We will answer all the other questions on the email. And just once again, thank you very much for attending. And hopefully we'll see you after Christmas in February for the next of the webinars on making reseeding work for you. Thank you very much to the panelists, and thank you all for listening. Good night to everybody. Thank you.
Thank you, everybody.
Thank you.